On this week's 51%, we speak with Dr. Sophia Chukas-Bradley about the mental health impact of social media on teens and young adults, and what parents can do if their child is struggling.
While there are individual things we all can do to have better experiences online, we're talking about a systemic structural problem here. And so it's important not to blame adolescents for the struggles they're having with mental health and the struggles they're having with social media.
I'm Jessie King. It's all up next on 51%.
I was standing around like one of those girls I had seen in a movie. The whole world was a movie back then. I had my sunglasses on, I wanted to be seen without seeing shy Lolita. I wasn't really in it, I didn't really get it.
You're listening to 51%, a WAMC production dedicated to women's issues and experiences. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jessie King. Social media can be addicting. Lately, though, the apps so many of us use every day have been scrutinized for how addicting they are to children. Last month, 33 states filed a lawsuit against Meta Platforms, Inc., the parent company of Facebook and Instagram, for knowingly designing its platforms in a way that they contend is harmful and addicting to young people, contributing to a youth mental health crisis. They're not the only ones who think that way. Right now, there's a bipartisan push in Congress to adopt regulations aimed at protecting kids online. A Facebook whistleblower who warned officials of the company's failure to protect children recently testified before a Senate subcommittee that kids on Instagram, particularly girls, can experience online bullying, aggression, misogyny, and even unwanted sexual advances. Meta, for its part, has said in a statement, quote, "Every day, countless people inside and outside of Meta are working on how to help keep young people safe online," end quote. Social media is pretty much ingrained in our culture now. I admittedly spend way more time online than I probably should. So whether or not Congress decides to take action here, what should consumers and parents know? That is our focus today. Our guest is Dr. Sophia Chukas-Bradley, a licensed clinical psychologist and assistant professor of psychology at the University of Pittsburgh. In 2017, she started the university's Teen and Young Adult Lab, a research center focusing on adolescent mental health and the various factors that shape it, including gender, sexuality, body image, and yes, social media. More recently, the lab has been working with Harvard's Center for Digital Thriving to develop social media intervention tools, techniques helping kids understand the harmful aspects of big tech that teachers can hand out in their classrooms. Just a note, before we start our conversation, Dr. Chukas-Bradley does discuss depression and suicide. If you or someone you love are in crisis, please know you're not alone and help is available. The National Suicide and Crisis Hotline is available 24/7 by texting 988 at 988lifeline.org.
Unfortunately, we're seeing evidence of a teen mental health crisis. So when we look at data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, what we see is over roughly the last 10 years, a major increase in depressive symptoms, anxiety symptoms, and suicidal ideation among adolescents today. And there are many different possible explanations for this. We do have data to suggest that social media is probably one of several factors that could help us understand this huge increase. But taking an even bigger step back, I think it's important to talk about some of the key features of adolescent development that can help explain why this is a period of life when people are at risk for mental health concerns, but also a period of life for really exciting identity development and exploration. So during adolescence, kids experience this major developmental change where their families, on average, take on a little bit less importance in terms of sense of self and decision making, for example, around risk behaviors, and peers take on great importance. This doesn't mean that parents don't play a huge role. They absolutely do. But at the transition from childhood to adolescence, roughly in the US, the transition from the elementary school to middle school years, kids begin to care a great deal about what their peers are doing, their peers' values and norms. And that is really important for how adolescents decide how to use their time, how to present themselves, how to live their lives. And the reason this is really important is because it can help us to understand why social media is so alluring for adolescents. By design, social media apps are designed to capture all of our attention, people of all ages, and keep us spending more and more time online so that the apps and companies behind them can make more money. But for adolescents, social media is especially relevant and important because it is a way to be connected to peers 24/7.
So, what are some of the most popular apps among teens right now?
Video-based apps have overtaken other types of social media apps as some of the most important and frequently used. So adolescents these days are spending most of their social media time on TikTok and YouTube. And many adults don't realize that YouTube is a form of social media. The reason we as researchers and psychologists consider it to be a form of social media is because adolescents can use it to broadcast their own material and to look at videos from both their peers and themselves, as well as from folks they don't know. So that's what differentiates it from a mass media source like TV or magazines, where adolescents are consuming media produced by folks they typically do not know in real life. And so we're just now, as psychology researchers, trying to understand the effects of video-based social media. One challenge of this field of research is that adolescents make more rapid changes in the types of social media apps they use and the way they use them than researchers can keep up with. So by the time adolescents, or rather by the time researchers have developed good measures for understanding what's going on with a specific social media app, adolescents tend to have moved on to a new app or at least a new way of using it.
Yeah, and the types of platforms out there seem to always be changing too. I know when I got my first phone, the options were Facebook and Twitter, or I guess now it's called X. That had just started when I got my first phone. So the types of media kids are consuming on these apps is drastically different in just the past decade or so. You mentioned that this is a big transition period for kids anyway, where the focus shifts from their parents to their peers. How has social media, I guess, altered that experience?
Great question. Social media interactions are fundamentally different from in-person interactions in a number of ways. And this is based on work I've done primarily with Jacqueline Nisi, who's an assistant professor at Brown, and with Mitch Prinstein, who's a professor at UNC Chapel Hill and also chief science officer at the American Psychological Association. And we developed this theory that we call, or rather framework, that we call the transformation framework. And it highlights these key features of social media that differentiate it from in-person interactions. So key features: social media is available 24/7 and in a wide range of locations. So prior to the advent of modern social media, adolescents would see their peers at school and they could plan time outside of school to see peers. But at the end of the day, the vast majority of adolescents would come back to their homes and there would be a period of time, at least while sleeping, when they would not have access to their peers. Now, because social media is available 24/7 and anywhere, anytime an adolescent has access to their smartphone, which for many adolescents is all throughout the day, all throughout the night, adolescents can now see content posted by their peers. They know that their peers can see content posted by themselves. And in many cases, adolescents are actively engaging in interactions with their peers all day and all night. So that's one key feature that differentiates social media interactions from in real life interactions. Another key feature is the quantifiability of social media. So adolescents have always been interested in various metrics of approval. For example, when I was in high school in the early 2000s, people might count their number of friends or the number of invitations they get to something. But on social media, adolescents have very concrete, quantifiable metrics of peer approval in the form of likes, friends, followers. This is really important because during adolescence, because peers are so important for adolescent sense of self, it is really socially rewarding to see these metrics of quantifiable peer approval. Research from UCLA and other places has found that adolescents' brains respond to seeing higher numbers of likes in a way that's similar to how they would respond to a number of other really rewarding stimuli. And this is especially true for adolescents, given features of brain development in which areas of the brain associated with social reward and the desire to do things that gain social reward, for example, engaging in behaviors that will lead to greater popularity, or engaging in behaviors that involve a sense of risk and sensation seeking. Those areas of the brain develop long before areas associated with cognitive control are fully developed. So for example, areas of the brain that allow adolescents to make choices guided by thoughts about long-term consequences. How does all this come together on social media? Adolescents may post things or engage in ways that are likely to gain immediate increases in likes, views, friends, followers, even if those things might not be the types of long-term behaviors that are going to set them up best for good outcomes.
The CDC's report last year said teenage girls were particularly vulnerable when it comes to their mental health right now. How does everything you just mentioned come together for girls specifically? What impact is social media having on them?
My research and research from other labs suggests that one of the most powerful ways social media affects adolescent girls' mental health and well-being is through body image concerns. Taking a step back from the world of social media, even before modern social media was invented, adolescent girls have long been at especially high risk for body image concerns and disordered eating. And to briefly address why, it's due to a range and this confluence of biological, cognitive, social, and sociocultural changes. So when adolescent girls, at least cisgender girls, those who were assigned female sex at birth and identify as girls, when they go through puberty, they gain weight in ways that bring them further away from societal standards of beauty that typically feature a thin ideal. And I'll note that beauty ideals have changed over time, and especially with the advent of modern social media. For example, how muscular or curvy the ideal body is has changed over time. But for the past 50 years, it has consistently featured a level of thinness that most adolescent girls cannot attain. And when they go from childhood to adolescence and undergo puberty with weight gain, this brings them further from the societal ideal. That's an example of a biological change. Cognitively, all adolescents, regardless of gender and sex, undergo this social cognitive phenomenon that psychologists call the imaginary audience, where they feel like they're in a spotlight and like everyone is uniquely concerned with their every move. You and listeners might remember if you ever had acne as a teen or a bad hair day or anything about your appearance that felt like a negative change for you, you were likely thinking about it throughout the whole day and were really fixated on it. And that's an example of the imaginary audience. I'll come back to the imaginary audience in a moment. But then socioculturally and interpersonally, adolescent girls and young women, and actually women of all ages across the lifespan, are socialized with this message that physical appearance is more important than anything else about us. That's a message that's broadcast through mass media, for example, starting with romantic comedies, where at least in the 90s and 2000s, the message was pretty consistently that a young woman going through a makeover would become more socially valuable to men. And all of these things come together in the world of social media, because on social media, it's a very visual set of platforms. The imaginary audience, we could argue, is no longer imaginary because any moment of one's real life can be photographed or videoed and broadcast to a network of peers. And adolescents are bombarded, and this is true for adolescents of all genders. They're bombarded with images that are what we call in psychology idealized images. For example, carefully curated, edited with filters, images and videos of peers and celebrities and influencers who are a unique category of folks who have become famous because of their social media presence. All of those images where folks have carefully selected and photoshopped images of themselves or videos of themselves are being broadcast to adolescents on their social media feeds, what they see when they go into an app, alongside idealized images of themselves. So my lab has long been studying a construct we call appearance-related social media consciousness. And at a very basic level, what this refers to is the extent to which adolescents and young adults are preoccupied and worried about how they may appear to a social media audience. And appearance-related social media consciousness is a phenomenon that doesn't just happen when people are online, it can happen offline as well. So online, someone might look at photos of themselves and critique them and imagine how they look to other people. But even when offline, an adolescent may be thinking about how would I look if a photo or video were taken of me right now? Or are people looking at photos or videos of me right now in this moment? And we found that adolescent girls and actually adolescent boys and gender minority youth, adolescents of all genders, who engage in higher levels of appearance-related social media consciousness and other types of social media-related body image concerns they're at higher risk over time for depressive symptoms. So that's the concern, is that this fixation on appearance is linked to mental health problems such as depressive symptoms. And I'll note that while we found that for kids of all genders, higher concerns about appearance on social media are linked to mental health concerns, at an average level, adolescent girls are especially high in these concerns about body image as related to social media.
And this is all just what the algorithms are throwing at them. This is sort of the nature of being on these platforms and scrolling. What about stuff like cyberbullying, though? Has your lab looked into the ways that cyberbullying is changing?
Our lab has not focused specifically on cyberbullying, but many psychologists and researchers have been studying cyberbullying. The problem with online spaces is that, well, one of the problems is that they allow for disinhibition. And by that, I mean the barriers that keep many of us from perpetrating aggression against each other in real life are removed. For example, online, we can't see other people's verbal and nonverbal responses to what we're doing if we're being aggressive. And that can lower the bar for engaging in aggressive action. Another piece, if we think again about those features of social media, the quantifiability of social media apps means that adolescents are sometimes rewarded socially for engaging in aggression against each other. For example, sometimes when adolescents are distributing funny but mean memes about other adolescents, that gets met with a lot of likes, or at least a lot of views, which can reinforce what the adolescent is doing. And another thing I wanted to be sure to highlight is the role of sleep. Would it be okay if I talked about sleep for a moment?
Yeah, of course.
So one of the clearest research findings from psychology research and related fields in the realm of social media use and adolescent mental health is that adolescents who sleep with their phones on and near them have poorer sleep. And poor sleep is believed to be one of the greatest contributors to mental health concerns in adolescence. Separate from the world of social media, poor sleep is linked with increased risk for anxiety, depression, physical health problems, and even suicidality. And when adolescents feel pressure to keep their phones near them and to check them repeatedly in the night when they get notifications, that disrupts sleep in a number of ways. It disrupts sleep literally by interrupting sleep, for example, with the noise of a notification. But also when adolescents look at their phones right before bed or in the middle of the night, the blue light emitted by those phones can disrupt sleep at a physiological level. Additionally, when adolescents are checking social media right before bed and or in the middle of the night, they're likely to see content from peers that's very activating. Because adolescents' brains are especially sensitive to any information related to social relationships and social reward, adolescents who see content related to their peers in the middle of the night are likely to have a hard time going back to sleep. So one of the strongest recommendations I offer to parents is, although it is unrealistic to take phones away from adolescents altogether, for the vast majority of adolescents, having no access to a smartphone, no access to social media would have detrimental social implications because the importance of peer relationships during this time. But parents should ensure that their kids are not sleeping with their phones at night. With very rare exceptions, for example, if adolescents need their phones to monitor something related to their medical history like diabetes, with very rare exceptions, I would say that adolescents should not have phones with them at night, given the extremely strong importance of sleep, particularly during the adolescent developmental years.
We're speaking with Dr. Sophia Chukas-Bradley, a clinical psychologist and founder of the Teen and Young Adult Lab studying adolescent mental health at the University of Pittsburgh. I'm glad you brought up the idea of not sleeping with phones, because I was going to ask, what are some of the best practices, I guess, to help your kids or protect them from this? I was actually going to ask, do you even get your kids a smartphone? But it sounds like the answer is yes, it's potentially unavoidable, but.
Given that I do believe social media is here to stay and that it's not realistic in most cases for adolescents to have that access completely taken away, I have a few recommendations. So the first, as I was mentioning, is to ensure that adolescents don't sleep with their phones. Another recommendation I have is for parents to actively listen to their adolescents to ask questions about what it is on social media that keeps adolescents spending so much time on it. And to really, with interest and curiosity, try to understand adolescents' experiences. Another recommendation I have is that parents check out the new resources available through the Center for Digital Thriving, which are designed to be used in classrooms, but can also prompt these really productive discussions between parents and kids with questions around, for example, what would it look like to spend more time on social media doing things that align with my values? So for example, adolescents whose core value is to have better friendships can ask themselves, am I actually using social media in a way that increases my interpersonal closeness with folks and improves my friendships? Or am I using social media in a way that's focused on my physical appearance and status? So those are just a few examples of some of the resources available on the Center for Digital Thriving website that parents can use to talk with their kids. If your adolescent is struggling with moderate to severe anxiety and depression, or if you're not sure how severe it is, but you're worried about your kid, the most important thing to do is to seek help. Many adolescents are in school settings where a school counselor could be the first point of contact. There are crisis hotlines parents can call, and many parents have access through health insurance or through other means to psychotherapy for their kids. And if psychotherapy is feasible for you, cognitive behavioral therapy and other evidence-based treatments for anxiety and depression are an excellent option to help adolescents who are struggling. One of the most important things a parent can do is to ask their kid open-ended questions and to actively listen to what they have to say. So for example, asking your adolescent, what are you seeing on social media that's causing stress for you? And then listening without interrupting, without asking interrogating follow-up questions, listening and just reflecting back what your kid is saying, and asking questions that are aimed at opening up the discussion rather than closing it. We know from research on what makes an effective therapist, what makes for the best marriage across all these different types of interpersonal relationships, one of the most important things is good communication skills, which starts with open-ended questions and active listening without interrupting and interrogating.
Well, lastly, what if your child has expressed thoughts of self-harm or suicide? I've occasionally taken on volunteer shifts as a crisis counselor, and that's something that is very difficult for anyone to talk about, really, parents and kids alike, because the stakes are just so high. They feel very high in that moment. If you're worried for your child on that level, how should you address it?
Sometimes parents are afraid to ask their kids about their depression and anxiety and are often especially afraid to ask directly about whether their kid has had thoughts of harming themselves. And what research suggests is that asking kids if they're thinking about suicide does not plant a seed for adolescents. It does not increase the likelihood that adolescents are going to hurt themselves. It is extremely important for parents to ask directly if they're worried about their kid, to ask directly if they have thought about harming themselves. And if the answer is yes, it's really important to seek help. At a very basic level, you can contact a crisis hotline where somebody can help you with what decision to make next. Taking your kid to the emergency room is an option. And longer term, an adolescent who's thinking about suicide should be receiving evidence-based psychotherapy and possibly psychiatric help as well in the form of medication or other interventions.
Well, Dr. Chukas-Bradley, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me. Is there anything else you'd like to leave our listeners with before we go?
One thing I want to be clear about for anyone, if there are adolescents listening, or for parents of adolescents or anyone who knows an adolescent who's struggling with social media, it's really important to note that while there are individual things we all can do to have better experiences online, we're talking about a systemic structural problem here. And so it's important not to blame adolescents for the struggles they're having with mental health and the struggles they're having with social media. In the case of social media, these are apps that are designed to be addictive. They are designed to capture our attention and to keep us coming back for more. That is how social media companies make money. If we are not paying for a subscription to a service, then we are the product. What I mean by that is social media companies operate through an attention economy where the more time we spend online and the more we click on ads, the more money is made. And the reason I'm emphasizing this is because it can be really easy for adults to blame adolescents for their problems with social media and to say things like, why can't you just get off your phone? But by design, these platforms are aimed at keeping us on our phones. And adolescents' brains are especially susceptible to the tricks that social media companies use to keep people online.
Dr. Sophia Choukas-Bradley is a licensed clinical psychologist, assistant professor of psychology at the University of Pittsburgh, and director of the Teen and Young Adult Lab. She is also the clinical psychology lead at the new Center for Digital Thriving at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. To learn more about her work, you can check out her website, sophiachoukas-bradley.com. And again, a reminder, if you or someone you love is in crisis, please know you're not alone and help is available. The National Suicide and Crisis Hotline is available 24/7 by texting 988 and at 988lifeline.org. We've been talking about the impacts of social media on teens and young adults. Here in New York, Governor Kathy Hochul and Attorney General Letitia James are putting their weight behind a pair of bills that would particularly go after the way platforms apply their algorithms. New York Public Media's Capitol correspondent Karen DeWitt reports.
Our children are in crisis, and it's up to us to save them.
Governor Hochul cites a warning from the U.S. Surgeon General that says children who spend 3 hours or more a day on social media are twice as likely to experience depression. Rates of self-harm among 10 to 14-year-old girls have risen by 200% since social media companies started using algorithms more regularly to determine what a user sees in their feed. Some teen suicides have been attributed to social media use. Hochul says the companies like TikTok, YouTube, and X, formerly known as Twitter, employ sophisticated and toxic algorithms, and she says teenage girls are especially vulnerable.
You understand how an algorithm works? It follows you. It preys on you. You don't ask for this content. It finds its way to you by very sophisticated ways that the social media companies have created to continue bombarding you and penetrating your mind with images and thoughts.
Kathleen Spence says her daughter Alexis created an Instagram account without her parents' consent when she was 11 years old to play an online game associated with a brand of stuffed animals. The innocent fun took a dark turn when Alexis started clicking on posts about fitness and body image. She ended up on sites promoting anorexia, and she developed an eating disorder.
It took years for our daughter to overcome her social media addiction and to finally recover from her eating disorder, her self-harm, and her attempt to take her own life.
Alexis is now 21. The measures include the Safe for Kids Act. It would require social media companies to get parental consent before applying algorithms to minors' accounts. Parents would also have to give permission for notifications to appear on their children's phones and tablets between midnight and 6 a.m. Another bill, the Children's Privacy Act, would forbid social media companies from harvesting personal data from minors. Violators could face fines of up to $5,000 for each instance. Attorney General James would be empowered to enforce those laws and impose the penalties. James says the bills are crafted to withstand potential constitutional challenges, and she says they do not in any way prohibit children's participation on platforms where they meet the minimum age requirement.
Both of these bills will in no way block minors or anyone from accessing social media platforms. Minors will have the same access they did before to connect with friends, search for topics of interest, and join groups. They just won't be shown addictive feeds unless their parents consent to it.
The measures are sponsored in the Senate by Andrew Gennardis and in the Assembly by Nili Rozek. Both are majority party Democrats. The measures won't be acted on, though, until the legislature comes back for the 2024 session in January. The governor, attorney general, and bill sponsors say they expect stiff resistance from the tech industry, which has a large corporate presence in New York. In Albany, I'm Karen DeWitt.
You've been listening to 51%. 51% is a national production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio in Albany, New York. It's produced and hosted by me, Jesse King. Our associate producer is Jody Cowan, and our theme is Lolita by the Albany-based artist Girl Blue. Just a reminder that you can listen to 51% anytime at WAMCpodcast.org or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can stay in the loop on all of WAMC's shows by signing up for our weekly newsletter Airwaves at WAMC.org. We hope you'll join us next week. Until then, I'm Jesse King for 51%.
I was every single girl, I was nobody else, I was so sure of myself. I was 15 and a half, he was a hollow laugh. And I lost my cool somewhere along the way. The nightmare down the hallway, I had to learn how to look away. I lost my cool.